And he did a 180 after the invasion and fully supported and endorsed Putin, and and encouraged a full takeover of Ukraine. And so he became a bit of a pariah, and he's no longer getting the kind of media attention in the West that he used to. But we wanted to talk to him. And by the way, this is for an upcoming episode of G Zero World that has yet to air. It's actually going to be the premiere episode of our sixth season, and you'll see it all next week. But this portion was obviously too newsy to hold on to, and so it is already out in the world, and you can see it on Ian's feed and on G Zero Media's Twitter. Essentially, Ian asked this very question, right? This is, again, as you said, Evan, hours, just hours, but hours before we knew what exactly was going down and that Prigozhin had started this march to Moscow. But we already knew that there was a showdown that was inevitable because of the refusal to comply with Putin himself saying, I need you guys to sign these contracts and be beholden to the defense ministry. So Ian asked that very question. And Dmitry Trenin, who again is not officially part of the Kremlin, but has held many roles in both defense and intelligence in Russia and is very close to Putin's inner circle, dismissed any notion that there was danger there and basically said the thought that you're implying Prigozhin is a threat to Vladimir Putin is ludicrous. Now, that could have been posturing, but I will add this. Today, as the story started to unfold, there were reports, numerous reports, that both US intelligence and military officials and members of NATO were taken by surprise at the level of escalation here, right? So it makes you wonder on both sides, and this is where I have to ask a question. I don't know if anybody here can answer it, but it's something that we're certainly looking into. How has the intelligence gotten so bad? Not just on the part of Putin's perhaps inner circle, not knowing exactly what's happening on the ground, right? Or misinforming him or painting a rose-colored world for him, but also the fact that it seems there's some intelligence lapses in the
Right.
West. And is this
Yeah.
because of a shutdown of again, like the 180 wasn't just Dmitry Trenin. The 180 happened almost instantly. I remember, and then I'll shut up, but this is also an interesting note. So in Munich, at the Munich Security Conference, this is February of last year, literally 3 or 4 days before the invasion began, John Kerry sat in front of us, and there was this looming threat of the invasion. But Ian said, you're obviously working very closely with your counterparts in Russia on climate action. Do you see this as in any way sort of shutting those conversations down? And he said, hey, it's business as usual for diplomats. We don't really see any chance that communication with Russia is going to be shut off. That was not true, right? And now, of course, we're in a situation where there really is no back and forth that's happening on any significant level, and that's in itself dangerous.
Okay, we're going to get to questions. Thanks, Tony. Alex, just real quick, a response to that on maybe not only internal intelligence failures, however, also the Western intelligence failures, and then put up your hands and we'll start blasting through some questions, Alex.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, that's an excellent point, Tony. And look, Putin has increasingly created a black box around himself over the past several years. His circle has gotten smaller. His advisors are more this is late stage autocrat syndrome, right? You go about the process over the course of 20 years of weeding out anybody who you don't like or tells you things you don't want to hear, and suddenly you're left with nobody who tells you things you don't want to hear, such as the Ukrainians might actually put a fight if we invade that country. Or, hey, empowering this Prigozhin guy might turn around, might not turn out so well. So I think that's one thing that's a common feature of increasingly sort of sclerotic dictatorships. But Tony's point about the West and outsiders not having as good information is really important as well. I mean, it starts even on the open source stuff, right? I mean, there are almost no Western journalists operating in Russia at all now. Some of the more prominent ones have been jailed just for doing their jobs.
Yeah.
Others have left. And on the intel side, I mean, there's been a lot of back and forth where Russia and the U.S. have thrown, spies out of each other's countries in recent years. You have to believe that now Putin, believing he's at war with NATO, has really cracked down on any intelligence activity by the West in Russia. So at all levels, it gets harder to understand what's going on inside Russia, for sure.
Okay, let's take some questions. I mean, there are basic questions like, is Putin weakened and can he survive? Is Prigozhin a dead man walking? There's lots of key questions. If we can go quickly, it's 2:24. I'm Evan Solomon. You're with Alex Clement and many others on the crisis in Russia on our G0 World Twitter space. Thanks for spending Saturday. I mean, the fact that we've got close to 1,000 people hanging out on a Saturday shows, this is so relevant, and we really appreciate the enthusiasm to try to understand a very complex situation. If I get your name wrong, feel free to not only call me out, but mangle my name in return. The first hand up is someone says M.A. M.A. I notice you've got a Toronto Maple Leafs logo there, M.A. So already my son would probably love you. Go ahead, man. What's up?
Thanks for having me, Evan. I kind of let me sneak in a two-part question. The first question is, so with this chain of events, and knowing Russia being masters at propaganda and disinformation, can they spin this in their favor and say, well, whatever happened, this uprising or this attempted coup or mutiny or whatever you want to call it is a CIA operation. It's by the West. It's by America.
I get it, right?
You guys remember? Yeah, remember in 2016, Erdogan had a coup in Turkey or attempted coup and immediately blamed the CIA for it. But obviously that propaganda came from Russia itself. We're learning. Can Russia turn this around in their favor? Number one. Number two, what will this do to Russia's overall strategy of perpetuating disinformation and kind of propping up, far right-wing populism? We're seeing the effects in North America, like the disruption of far right-wing populism, even in Canada. What will that do, if anything, to that? So thank you
First of all,
for taking that.
Great questions. First question, Alex, I'll throw to you, and it's a good one. I mean, we have underestimated the vulnerability of dictators. Look at Syria, maybe as the classic example. They teeter on the brink and then they survive. Lukashenko, of course, in Belarus, stole the election and remains unpopular but in power. Can Putin turn this around? And though the conventional narrative now is this seriously weakens him, which I frankly buy, is there a way that he uses this to embolden himself and turn this into his favor?
That's a great question. I think the parallel with Turkey is an instructive one. Turkish President Recep Erdogan did not create Fethullah Gulen, the leader of the religious cult who he blamed for launching the coup against him. Right? The case in Russia is that Putin has invested a lot of time and money and political capital in creating the Prigozhin phenomenon, in creating Wagner Group as an arm, as an unofficial, quasi-official arm of the Russian state. So if he turns around and says, guys, this was a CIA plot, it's not going to, the propaganda capabilities of the Russian state are extreme and very acrobatic, but that would defy even, Putin's level of acrobatic propaganda. I don't think he can say that. It will be interesting to see what he does say, because he already went on television and said, this man Prigozhin has issued a stab in the back to the Russian nation. This is an uprising. We will crush this. So now that a deal has been reached, some kind, for him to go home, I think Putin's got to say something. I don't think it will be, this was a plot by the West,
right?
Because it wouldn't be credible.
Yeah, and by the way, Prigozhin, he denied the existence of the Wagner Group for years until just before the war, where he was kind of outed as a ally of Putin, and of course it became a very important part of the invasion of Ukraine. As for your second question, which is a good one, I think Russia will continue their cyber style disruptions of the West. But again, I think the bigger question is, you're right, is how does Putin now respond to this? Is he openly weakened or not? It was the fact that he even had a press conference, that 5-minute statement, by the way, was remarkable. But great question. There's another question here. I've got, let's go to Tushar. I might be mangling your name, and if so, please correct it. Thanks for joining us. What's your question for Alex?
Hi guys, how have you been? I've been following the crisis which is happening right now, and I wanted to check and update and even take your feedback on what's happening. And do you see now the EU and NATO taking keen interest in what's happening and how Putin is now creating his own style of so-called propaganda? And how do you see EU and NATO taking this stance forward, along with the United States and
Good,
UK? Thank you.
good question, Alex. How does the West respond?
Well, I think carefully is the answer. I mean, as we talked about a couple minutes ago, I think there's two things for the West to look at. One, how does this affect Ukraine's efforts in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, Ukraine's efforts to carry on the counteroffensive? But then secondly, is there a risk of a significant destabilization or civil war in Russia? And as I said earlier, I mean, I think it would be madness to wish for that to happen. And that if you're NATO, you've got to be very careful. On the one hand, you certainly don't like Putin very much, but as we've seen over the past day or so, the only even remotely viable option to challenge Putin is an even worse figure. So that's what I'd say about that.
Yeah, I think they're handling it as radio. I think they're quiet now. They're prepared, but just Tushar, 1 point. Poland went on its highest possible alert, and I think the EU has raised their alert levels because of obviously the potential not only for accidents, but you've got two very unpredictable, as someone texted me earlier, two psychopaths, Prigozhin and Putin. Again, not the word I used, but one, and a nuclear football. So there's a lot of worry here. Emily.
And hey, Evan, can I just
True
jump in
that.
on that question really quickly too? Because I do want to say, look, what we got out of Dmitry Trenin, because the first question really was how is this continuing to be justified within Russia, right? So I think everybody needs to understand that Putin and everyone within Russia who's supporting the war in Ukraine sees this not as a war of Russia versus Ukraine, but Russia versus NATO and the United States, right? So I think it's like critically important. Alex touched on this, but also Ian has, provided this analysis throughout as well, that to Tushar's question, the best thing that the US and NATO can do right now is remain calm and kind of do nothing, right? Because there's already doing quite a bit in terms of supplying weaponry, intelligence, strategy. But anything that's viewed as more openly antagonistic than that only fuels Putin's whole propaganda machine that this is in fact a war with the West and not Ukraine.
Which goes back to MA's point. Thanks, Tone. Let's go to Emily. You've had your hand.
Thanks,
You've
Stephen.
had your hand up. Thanks, Tushar. Emily, welcome on a
Thank,
Saturday geopolitical discussion on these crazy events, fluid events that we're still trying to assimilate and understand. Go for it.
thanks so much, and thank you all for doing this. So, I'll try to make this as brief as possible. To kind of go back to like the base question for me is like, unless this was either just Prigozhin being impulsive, which is kind of like Occam's razor, I still don't understand what the point of it would be unless he was delusional enough to think that like this was he would be able to like stage a coup and be a leader, whatever, which I as I guess it's possible, but like I don't know, it also seems impossible. So I simply don't get like the
Right.
baseline like why. I mean, and I
It's a
know
great,
that
you know
sounds
what, Emily,
stupid, but
that is
why?
not stupid. That is, I think, maybe the most important question to understand and foundational. So, and I'm going to go to Alex, but Alex, this is really key. Why was Prigozhin in this situation? Well, that the fight with Shoigu and Gerasimov and the leaders of the military, obviously, was that an internal strife that was reaching a peak? Putin couldn't control him anymore. What do you think led to the fact where he had no option but not just to pull out? I know he alleges that the army bombed Wagner Group and killed up to 2,000 people. We haven't confirmed any of that. But was his only option, I'm toast. They're coming for me. Putin's coming for me. I have to go on the offensive. That's my only option to survive here, Alex.
Wait, before
Yeah,
you
I
do
mean,
that, Alex, I'm so sorry. One more
yeah,
baseline point, if you don't mind addressing, is
sure.
what Wagner troops in like Africa or parts of the Middle East, like how kind of where they are staged elsewhere, will also factor in. Thank you.
Good question, Emily. Alex.
So it's a great question, and it's a question that even people who've spent their lives studying Russia are also struggling to answer. So you should not feel that it is a that it is a stupid question by any stretch of the imagination. It is the most important question. I think it's useful to think of Russia not as a kind of unitary state where Putin controls this monolithic army and bureaucracy, and think of it more like a crime family. In which there are various players, some of whom are more powerful than others, but all of them are jostling for, favor and money and perks from the boss, right? Um, Putin elevated one of his lieutenants here, Prigozhin, in a very extreme and ultimately quite public way that was, as I said earlier, very useful to him to achieve aims in Africa, in Syria, and ultimately in Ukraine. And from Prigozhin's perspective, he had the juice, right? I mean, this is a guy who was basically allowed to run his private army, extracting all kinds of money and all kinds of privileges from that, and started to do reasonably well in Ukraine, and just felt ultimately that his position was being compromised by one of the other guys in the family, who's Shoigu, and the actual army itself. And once that sort of power struggle between them began, I think Putin, maybe saw it as advantageous at a certain level to, keep people off balance with each other. But Prigozhin, I think, as Evan says, started to see that that the walls were closing in on him a little bit once Shoigu had lobbied Putin to order Wagner Group to be under the defense ministry. I mean, this is all it sounds sort of confusing Kremlinology and sort of very detailed stuff, but I think it's useful to think about it in that way because it's not about contests for political power at the highest level. It's more like constantly squabbling with each other over favor and resources and scraps and privileges, right? And so I think Prigozhin probably saw himself about to take quite a large loss by being basically appointed as the defense minister's intern from now on, and didn't want to deal with it and thought, I've got the juice. I've been fighting this war in Ukraine. I'm really popular in Russia. And I can show Putin that actually, and Shoigu in particular, the defense minister, that I can't be rolled. And the guy made it, 3/4 of the way to Moscow just to demonstrate that.
I would say the other, Emily, first of all, those are great questions. We don't know what's going to happen, by the way. Let's say this truce holds or whatever deal it is, however we describe it. How long does Prigozhin stay? Can Putin even tolerate him? Prigozhin has proven to be very difficult, very unpredictable. He's still got huge forces making a lot of money in Africa and is important geopolitically for the Russians. Then again, the Chechens, they have a private army of 25,000, 30,000 in Russia. There's a big power struggle going on. So that's a great question. Let me get Ryan in there. Ryan,
one thing
yeah,
actually,
go ahead.
Emily, sorry, very quickly. Emily asked what countries is Wagner Group active in Africa. It's mainly Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, and a little bit of Libya. Those are the key ones.
And the things that they are doing there are pretty violent. And Ryan, go ahead. Let's bring.
Thank you,
Ryan.
guys.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question was about the Chechen group. They seem to be the biggest threat to the Wagner Group, except for the forces in Moscow. Is it worth watching their movements and activities in the next week or so?
Yeah, and Alex is going to do a quick deep dive on Khyadorov and the Chechens and who they do. Let's talk about who they are, because Ryan, that is a key question, because they were headed for Rostov if this thing didn't settle for what was going to look like a potential open conflict there. Can you just give us a little primer on that, Alex Clement, and maybe get to Ryan's question?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so Ramzan Kadyrov is the strongman leader of Chechnya, the Chechen Republic, which is part of Russia. He basically what happened when Putin defeated the Chechen rebels in the early 2000s who were seeking independence from Moscow. When he defeated them, he basically co-opted Ramzan Kadyrov's father, really, who was a prominent cleric in Chechnya and warlord, who was killed. Then Ramzan Kadyrov took over. Putin's greatest, the most important dragon, I would say, that Putin created, at least until Prigozhin, was Ramzan Kadyrov. He basically said, okay, we're going to call off the war on Chechnya, which we have already won. You can have basically your own private army in Chechnya, do whatever you like with the place, on one condition, that you never, ever again challenge Moscow's sovereignty over Chechnya. And Kadyrov took the deal, and ever since, he has been, I mean, on some of almost comically bootlicking loyal to Putin, in the 20 years since. He controls this. I mean, it's officially part of the Russian security services, but what it really is basically a private army of about 25,000 guys who help him control Chechnya. They also have been active in Ukraine on a number of fronts, particularly early in the war. There is no love lost between Prigozhin and Ramzan Kadyrov. So when Prigozhin announced he was marching from Rostov all the way to Moscow, Kadyrov immediately came out and said, we will support Putin on this. And there were open source reports that some of the Kadyrov's men were going towards Rostov in an effort to dislodge Wagner. That looks like it's been called off now, but who knows? I mean, Kadyrov is to say the least. I think it would be mild to describe him as a psychopath. So if you have a situation where Kadyrov and Prigozhin get into it despite whatever deal has been reached with Putin, that could turn ugly very quickly. But the Kadyrov thing is interesting. I just want to finish on this, because from Putin's perspective, the Kadyrov experiment worked, right? It was an example of, okay, you can't really control Chechnya on your own. Give a guy a fiefdom and a private army of his own, so long as he's loyal to you, and that's useful to you, right? That's useful to you as Putin. And for 20 years, it's worked out really well. So I think when he was creating Wagner Group and creating the Prigozhin phenomenon, he probably thought it would work out just as well, and he was wrong.
Yeah, the old saying, Alex, you can feed the beast for so long and eventually you end up in its belly. And I guess that's the big question for Putin and for all of these, the Kadyrov and Prigozhin. Okay, it's 2:41. I'm Evan Solomon. Alex Clement is here along with the G0 team and more than 1,000 of you. I just want to welcome a couple of folks I recognize. We've got MPs from the Canadian government like Steve McKinnon, welcome. We've got comedians like Gavin Crawford, who's also listening in. We've got people from governments. And the reason I really like that is politics, at G0 for us, everything is political. And our goal is to really make sure that people have accessible understanding of politics because it influences all of us. And we can have a normal discussion. You can hear Alex Clements. I think his kids are in the background. It's Saturday afternoon. We're all doing stuff. We got kids and dogs and pets. We're still concerned about the world. So I really appreciate more than over 1,000 of you weighing in. So great questions. And we're all part of this community of concern about what's going on in the world. There's a speaker now named Alex. Go ahead, Alex.
All right. Can you guys hear me by chance?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, perfect. I'm using headphones. I always feel you got to double check nowadays compared to AirPods. But my question is the following here. The first question is, I have a gut feeling in the back of my mind, reports are going to be coming out that the reason why Prigozhin took the deal, pretty much the equivalent of an arsonist setting fire and then calling the fire department on himself. Whether or not, right, if he lost the support of the main oligarchs controlling the Moscow area and like the real powerhouses first. And secondly, if I look at escape routes, so if I look at both Putin and I look at Prigozhin, so I'll start with Prigozhin. Where does Prigozhin go from here, considering how a deal's now been, I guess not officially signed, but soon to be? Where does he go? Because it seems to me like he's persona non grata. And secondly, for Putin, if Putin was generally concerned about the collapse of Russia, why would Putin go back to his home base in St. Petersburg, which is the eastern part of Russia? And if he really wanted to protect himself, why not go to the west so he can hop over to the Chinese border if he was really scared of either losing power, losing his life, or of anything happening. And I say that last one because let's say if things do go south in terms of the collapse of the Russian government and all that, where would Putin go next from St. Petersburg? He's surrounded by NATO, a NATO lake in the Baltic. It's not like he can hop over to Kaliningrad. That'd be a tougher route. And last, not like he can go to Belarus, really, because it's pretty much an enclave of the Russian state. But just shout out to everyone here. I'm a Canadian as well, from Ottawa, Ontario. Just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, great questions. Our call in one of our calls at EG is that, obviously Putin, though facing probably his most dramatic threat, Alex, is not worried that this is going to lead to an overthrow imminently. In other words, he's not, this isn't, a Ceausescu type situation where he's concerned about that. And I don't think it's reached that level. So I wouldn't read his, going near whatever border because he's already plotting his escape. I don't even think we're in that world. But, when it comes, Alex Clement, when it comes to dictators, they're there forever until they're not. There's always a sudden collapse. But you want to take a crack at Alex C's question, Alex Clement?
Well, St. Petersburg is really his home turf, right? I mean, it's where he's from. It's where he's, so I think it's, I agree with Evan that I don't think, if he got on a plane and went to Magadan, which is like the far eastern Russia, first of all, it would take him 12 hours to get there. But second of all, that looks like, yikes, I'm really scared that this is going to go south, right? That's basically Yanukovych fleeing, Kiev in March 2014, right? You don't want to do that until you absolutely have to. And by the time you absolutely have to, you probably can't make it anymore. So I don't read too much into him going to St. Petersburg as opposed to anywhere else. But look, I think the bigger question of, Putin has taken a hit from this, no matter how you look at it, right? I mean, the guy has had to go on television and announce to the Russian people that someone was trying to launch an one of his own lieutenants, mind you, was trying to launch an armed rebellion against him. And so much of the power and, sort of legitimacy, as it were, of dictators relies on the perception of their having everyone under control and the perception that the risk of challenging is too great, right? And the second that starts to get pierced, things can unravel quickly, even if it's true that some deal has been reached. And by the way, we don't know what that deal is yet.
Right.
All we know is that some deal has been reached, right? I find it hard to believe we'll go right back to the status quo, but we don't know.
Yeah, look, it's 2:46. We'll go for 14 more minutes. I'm going to do something that Tony, who's the executive producer of G0 World, will kill me for, but that's okay. I want Alex.
We'll find out
because this is something that even I don't want to do, but I think it's important when you're discussing Russia, and to understand this, you have to kind of see history. And Alex Clement sent us a note saying, look, if you want to understand what this means, this Prigozhin rebellion inside Russia, you should go back to the time of Catherine the Great and look at the Pugachev rebellion. No, but I think it's important because because this is not yet a populist uprising. Now, under Catherine the Great, there was a popular uprising, the Pugachev. Is this that? Are we seeing a populist, or is this very much a Prigozhin survival tactic that will not become a populist rebellion?
I mean, look, for the real Russian history buffs, it is exactly 250 years since the Pugachev rebellion started. And briefly speaking, what that was a disaffected former czarist lieutenant led a populist peasant rebellion against the Kremlin during a war with the Ottoman Empire, which succeeded in creating an alternate republic in the Volga Valley for 2 years before they finally caught up to him, brought him to Moscow, and executed him. That was a populist peasant uprising. The language of Pugachev is familiar to us today. It's, the elites are screwing you and, they're so corrupt and out of touch. And we need to do that. Prigozhin plays with that language. And if you look at like a lot of, the Telegram channels that are pro Prigozhin, the idea that the Russian elite is corrupt and screwing the average Russian guy, average Russian soldier, that is a very rich vein of resentment to tap, right? Most Russians, Putin is the leader, they respect him and so on, but there is a long running feeling that the government is always a corrupt, the state is always out to get you and screw you. And he's trying to tap into that with what he's saying. And he has some juice. He has some credibility, right? This guy is not just sitting around watching TV. He's been on the front lines fighting in Ukraine with his guys. His guys, by the way, are a absolutely horrendous lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of white supremacists, neo-Nazis, a lot of former prisoners. He basically filled his ranks by emptying out a bunch of prisons in Russia. So this is not a nice group of people. But it's interesting when you look at some of the footage of them moving through Rostov. Some people were coming out and greeting them and saying,
Yeah.
"Hey, do your thing. This is great. Screw those elites in Moscow." No one would say screw Putin, but they would say screw those other fat cats and elites who are enriching themselves while we're eating crap down here in the trenches. So that populist tradition, I think, is worth looking at in Prigozhin's language. It is not widespread, but it is a vein that can be tapped.
Alex Clement speaking from G0 Media. By the way, we have a G0 Media, G0 daily newsletter in the mornings. It's free. Subscribe at G0 Media. Alex will be writing something. We do. Ian Bremmer writes an edition every Wednesday night. We have a G0 North on Canada-U.S. relations as well. We cover all this stuff. By the way, thank you for bringing up the Pugachev rebellion. I know I'm totally into that stuff. If those of you think that was completely arcane and dopey to go down the History Channel, I'm a Rest of History podcast nut anyway, so I love that stuff. I think it's helpful. And Alex, I really appreciate it. Tony and I come from broadcast news where when you say Pugachev rebellion, people say you just lost the entire audience, but not this audience, not the G0 audience. So thanks, Alex. I actually think that's super informative and helpful to understand. I'm going to go with Nabanita, who has been waiting for a question. Nabanita, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, and I've been the other side of the Atlantic in the UK, and I have one basic question. Is this a pre-planned coup? Is this something that Putin needed to do to save himself? And I think that's a question we've got to look into because this was expected, right? And I was expecting something like this since my morning here. And that's my question to you is because, Wagner has been, a part of Putin's whole, whole power force. So was this because I couldn't believe it when I heard that they were like rebelling like this. So was it a part of a bigger plan is my question, and can somebody respond to that? Because I have a bad feeling that he is not getting along very well with the the top of the defense ministry right now. And has he used this and stunned the West into believing that there was a coup
Right.
happening? But this coup was his arranged
So
thing.
great question, and I'll throw it to Alex. I would just say just one way we try not to speculate on things we don't have evidence of. I don't have a source deep inside the Kremlin that's saying this is actually some kind of. I don't see any sort of top line benefit for Vladimir Putin to have somehow set this up. This seems overall to be seriously weakening to him, distracting from the defense. So, the idea that somehow he would have coordinated this, I don't see any evidence of that. Alex Clement, to you.
It's very hard to imagine, that Putin would see any real benefit in. Let's take it. Let's say that this actually went according to plan. It's hard for me to see the benefit of Putin demonstrating to the entire country and world that there is suddenly another figure who is so brazen and powerful that the guy can march halfway to Moscow before deciding on his own to turn around and go back into his barracks. I mean, that is a very, so even if it went according to plan, the message that it sends is hard to parse for anything good for Putin. And secondly, things don't always go to plan. So if this were, Putin would have to have taken an extraordinary risk that this would go wrong. and that more people would support Prigozhin, and it would take on a life of its own, which could have ended very badly. So, I take your point that Putin plays a lot of five-dimensional chess, and a lot of five-dimensional chess is attributed to Putin. I think sometimes maybe more than is necessary, but it strikes me as very hard to see a way in which this helps Putin.
Yeah.
I just can't see it.
Okay, great point. We've got about 7 minutes left. We're going to try to drill through a couple more questions. Bodibe, am I pronouncing your name right? Go
Yes,
ahead. Thanks for joining us.
yes, yes, you did 100%. Thank you so
Beautiful.
much. And thanks to the G0 team for hosting this. It's 2053 on my end in South Africa. So it's really quite interesting discussion you have.
Wonderful.
I just got three quick questions. I think the first one is, does the Wagner troop actually open up space for Putin's other adversaries to take a shot? Second question is, what's the probability of this particular troop taking down Putin and therefore collapsing Russia? And the third point is that what does that mean for the for political economy and global economy as a whole when Russia collapses in the state? Thank you so much.
Great question. I'm going to throw it to Alex. I'm just going to modulate your last Bodibe point. We have not accepted the premise that Russia is, quote, collapsing at all yet. That is far from a certainty, even though the ruble has collapsed a bit. Go ahead, Alex Clement.
So if I understand your question, the question is, does the fact that this happened at all open space for others to challenge Putin? Is that the core of the question?
That's the first part of the question. The second part is the Wagner troop, at least on my end, reports are suggesting that they're technically quite astute. What's the probability of them, really taking on Putin and taking over Moscow and collapsing the situation there?
Well, let me take the second question first. For this to have worked, I mean, when we say this, we mean Prigozhin marching on Moscow and effecting some kind of significant change in the leadership, either of the defense ministry or of the Kremlin. For that to have worked, 25,000 guys who've been plucked out of jail and given weapons is not enough when you're faced with the full force of the Russian army. What Prigozhin would have needed, and may still be able to get at some point if he decides to start this up again, is the support of mid-ranking officers in the security services and army who, coup specialists will always tell you, right? The top army brass are never the ones you need in order to foment a coup. You need the mid-ranking guys, the frustrated, the disgruntled guys, right? Those are the ones who make a coup work, right? Because the top army brass are always going to say we're loyal to, or almost always going to say we're loyal to the regime and so on. So you need a critical mass of security folks in the mid-ranking and lower-ranking levels, and probably a couple prominent oligarchs to say, yeah, we're willing to fund you. That's tough to do in Putin's regime, or has been tough to do in Putin's regime, because the cost of exit, to use a political science term, basically the cost of turning your back on the Putin regime has been extremely high up until now, right? Because you basically wind up, dead. Don't stand next to a window if you're going to turn your back on the Putin regime, right? What this does, I think, is open a little bit of space for doubt. Say, hey, this guy made it within 125 miles of Moscow with an armed rebellion against Putin. That's Putin's words, not mine. Armed rebellion are Putin's words, right? So I think it opens up a little bit of space of doubt, which if it hasn't, turned into defections as of right now, I think it certainly opens a little more space for that to happen in the future. Definitely.
Right. You want to take on the next question, yeah. Alex? We got 3 minutes.
What was the next question? If I kind of tried to answer them both together, like Wagner couldn't have pulled this off by themselves, so they would have needed more help than it looks like they got in order to actually attack Moscow. But in the longer term, I think they've opened up a little more doubt about who's really running things in a way that could be harmful to Putin. Yeah.
One last question. Impact, and some have asked this, so I'm going to do some rapid fire. But Eva, thank you. What about the economic consequences on this? And what is the consequence? What does this do to, let's say, U.S. support of the Ukrainian situation, knowing now that there's significantly more internal strife inside Russia?
Well, the ruble collapsed today. Russia's economic situation is increasingly isolated to begin with. But does it affect their ability to sell oil to countries that want oil? Probably not. As far as the Ukraine situation goes, yeah, if you're the U.S., I mean, you're probably pretty psyched about the prospect that Russian lines might not have as good morale or performance. That will certainly be good news for the Ukrainians, who have had a harder time in the early weeks of their counteroffensive than I think they wanted to. But the longer run stuff, we have to wait and see.
Let's go to China real quick. If you're China, you've been looking at this, you're an ally, you're not providing weapons, but you're like, okay, what happens in Ukraine is very material to my tensions in the Straits and Taiwan. Does this give China a little pause to say, man, a year ago, Putin was in a very different place. Now he's facing internal struggles and he's losing externally because of a emboldened NATO. Does this situation change China's calculus vis-a-vis Taiwan? Too early to say, but what's the message it's sending early on, Alex Clement?
Well, I think it's way too early to say what happens with Taiwan. But, if you're Xi Jinping, you got to be looking at Russia thinking, man, with friends like these, God, Russia has been useful to Xi Jinping, useful to China as a more vociferous critique of the unipolar U.S.-led world order than China ever could be itself. But the last thing China wants is for Russia to experience any significant political instability. I mean, from the U.S.'s perspective, it's 10,000 miles to Moscow, but China's got a border with Russia. The last thing they want is for anything bad to happen in politically in Russia.
Okay, last minute. I'm going to go around the horn. Tony and Gabrielle, I'm going to give you a last word, and I'm going to ask the last question. Please answer very briefly. What are you watching for now? I'll start with you, Alex, because you're hot on the stove still. What are you now looking at this moment to watch for?
What kind of deal did Prigozhin actually get? All we know is that he said he's going to turn around and go back to his positions. We don't know what the deal was that Lukashenko arranged with him. One early indicator will be, does Wagner Group get subordinated to the defense ministry or not? That's one piece of information that will tell us a lot about how this thing ended up. The second piece of information is Yevgeny Prigozhin alive on Monday morning?
That's what I was going to ask. Is he dead man walking? I think he's in a bunker in Rostov protecting himself. I'm watching to see how long he stays in control of that. Tony, what are you watching for?
I would say, look, what's fascinated me all along is that nobody really knows what's in the hearts and minds of most Russian people, right? Those lines of communication are not very open to begin with. I think it's a misnomer that they don't have access to a wide swath of information. I think many people have VPN and are able to access more sort of global news than you think. But one thing that Dmitry Trenin told us that resonated with me is that, and I believe it's probably true, this hasn't had the same impact, obviously, in Russia that it would have that it's having in Ukraine, because the war hadn't come to people's doors. Obviously, if you have children serving in the military, that's a different story, but that's still a relatively small part of the population. Right now, with any threat of a civil war looming, if this were to, after Monday, Prigozhin's not dead, and it does escalate again, with bloodshed outside of your apartment in Moscow, how does that change how people view the Putin regime?
Thanks, Tony. Gabrielle, what are you watching for?
I'm watching what this means for the future of the Wagner Group more broadly. Putin has been saying, over the past 24 hours, that Prigozhin is a traitor. And that doesn't have just implications for what goes on in Russia or in Ukraine, but also for the group's operations and all these far-flung conflicts that Alex mentioned earlier. So how does the group go back to acting as this, mercenary group that coordinates so closely with the Russian state and with Putin in particular, after the Kremlin has essentially said he's a traitor that needs to be dealt with? So the future of the entire organization is really quite murky, and I'm very interested to see how this develops over the coming weeks and months.
Great point. I'm going to, in the immediate short term, I'm very much watching what happens to Shoigu. If Shoigu is tossed under the bus, as it were, or out the window, in a deal where Prigozhin demands that he leaves in return for him standing down to Moscow. So that's, to Alex's point, what's the deal and what happens to the army? Who's in control of Rostov? How do the Ukrainians respond? And what does Putin do next? Does Putin use this to purge some of his less capable staff, and how does he shore up support? We are now at well over an hour. We still have almost 1,200 people listening. So it shows there's a huge appetite. I'm going to leave it there because it's Saturday and the situation's evolving. I first want to thank Alex Clement, who's been writing about this. In the next hour, we may end up putting a special edition of G0 World or G0 Daily out on a Saturday that will summarize some of Alex's points and some of this discussion. So, Alex, thanks. I know you've got the kids and everything going on, but you've done an extremely great job. Tony, Gabrielle, Tracy, Melianthi, and Emily for hosting it. Thanks to the G0 team. The G0 team's been phenomenal on a Saturday, but mostly thanks to all of you. Look, this stuff is phenomenally important. We love these discussions. Please continue to ask questions. We'll do, if you ask us to do more of these, we'll do these as much as you want. Please subscribe. I got to do a little shilling here. Please subscribe to G0 Daily. It's free at g0media.com. You can subscribe. It's free. The newsletters come in every day. They're phenomenal. You can ask questions. They're a lot of fun. And then watch G0 World on PBS, both in the United States and Canada with Ian Bremmer. So thanks to everyone. I'm going to throw it back to Emily. It's an evolving situation. And I'm Evan. Thanks again for everyone. Emily, over to you.
Thanks so much, Evan, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm personally hearing an applause sound effect. I'm not sure if everyone else is.
I don't know where that came from, but that was kind of
That's amazing.
Wow, Twitter keeping us on our toes every day. I love it. But yeah, thank you so much.
That was me. Well done, guys. This was a great show.
Oh, was that you? But that was very well. You could, if you got sound effects and good questions, Bodibe, we love you in South Africa. That's great. Thanks for that.
Exactly. Bring them back to the next Twitter space. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I was chatting with Gabrielle on the side, and she kind of alerted me to, at this time, like, a lot of media outlets have kind of downsized foreign reporting desks. And as a result, a lot of Americans aren't really able to fully grasp what's happening right now in Russia and, and all over the world. So I've just really enjoyed being part of this super eye-level conversation where we've all got to sit down together and unpack what's going on. So thank you, G0 community. And you can find more of this. We'll be keeping up with what's going on our social channels. So at G0 Media, everywhere you get your social media. And as Evan said, our newsletter, the G0 Daily, so g0media.com/subscribe. So thank you all so much for being here. Follow us on social media, and we'll see you next time. And have a great weekend.
This was better than talking about Zuck versus Musk on a potential battle. This was so. Thanks, everyone. Have a good Saturday, and obviously our thoughts are with those people inside those conflict zones that are suffering. Emily, great job. Thanks, everyone.